Hello and welcome, everyone. Tonight, it is Sunday night, September 3rd, 2023. My name is Glenn Rawson. And right now, I am in Stratford upon Avon in England. I'm at the home, birthplace, and burial place of William Shakespeare. Brought our group in here this afternoon, and we've been having a wonderful time visiting those sites. I welcome you tonight, and thank you for joining me. I just wanted to let you know very quickly that the new book, When Faith Endures, which is the Season 4 collection of the stories that we sent out on the weekly subscriptions, When Faith Endures, has just arrived. And the VIPs are getting their copy for free. If you'd like to purchase a copy of these popular stories, you can go to glennrawsonstories.com. But just to let you know, the book is here. All right, as always, tonight, guys, I ask for an interest in your prayers as we proceed. Tonight, I want to talk about stories of England and the UK from the British Isles. So let's begin with this. The year was 1875, and two missionaries serving in Liverpool, England, happened to be walking home one night when they noticed a young boy standing on a bridge. Thinking that he was too young to be out so late, they offered to walk the lad home. Well, the offer was accepted, and the missionaries walked him to his humble home, where they met his mother, a widow, with 4 small children living in terrible poverty. The missionaries and their message were accepted, and that family joined the church. Later that same year, with the help of the Perpetual Immigrating Fund, the family left England and came to Utah, where they continued to struggle for their survival. That missionary who had baptized the little boy soon completed his mission, and when reporting his labors was heard to say, "Brothers and sisters, I think that my mission has been a failure. I've labored all my days as a missionary here, and I've only baptized one dirty little Irish kid." End of quote. Well, the missionary returned home and made his home somewhere in Montana. Many, many years passed. Somewhere after the year 1933, this former missionary, now an old man, heard a knock at his door. And when he opened up the door, there was, standing upon the threshold, a distinguished-looking visitor, a small man, only about 5 foot 5 inches tall, but with a commanding voice and presence. The man asked, "Are you Elder so-and-so?" The man said he was. The visitor then asked, "Do you remember having said that you thought your mission was a failure because you had only baptized one dirty little Irish kid?" And the man said, "Yes." The visitor then stuck out his hand and said, "I would like to shake hands with you. My name is Charles A. Callis of the Council of the 12 Apostles. I am that dirty little Irish kid." What that missionary could not have known in 1875 was that that dirty little Irish kid would grow to become not only an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, but one of the greatest missionaries of the early 20th century. My friends, you and I labor daily to do our duty, to do good. And sometimes we wonder if we're doing any good at all. I know today I've thought that very thing. But I say to you, as I say to myself, don't be discouraged. You never know what good can and will come of your kindness, your compassion, and your efforts. Thank you for serving. And I tell that story because we were just on the docks in Liverpool, Albert Docks in Liverpool, yesterday. We left Liverpool this morning. Again, this story comes out of Eddington, England. We're in England now. The date was June 15th, 1875. Again, young James was only 11 years old, and he was not yet baptized. Why? Because he had been sick. His father vowed that if James survived his recent life-threatening illness, that ordinance would not be put off any further. James would be baptized immediately. And now, finally, that time had come. They scheduled the baptism and planned to do it at night because the local residents were very much against the church, and they would, of course, make a spectacle and disrupt the ordinance. So, shortly before midnight, James's father went out and surveyed the area near the Kennet River Bridge where that service was to be performed. There was no one about. He went back again one more time, just to be sure that all was safe. Then James accompanied his father out to the mill race that ran parallel to the Kennet River. His father entered the water and took James by the hand, and just then James said, "We were veritably horror-stricken by a combined shriek, yell, scream, howl. I know not how to describe the awful noise, such as none of us had ever heard. It seemed to be a combination of every fiendish cry we could conceive of." "I remember," James said, "how I trembled at the awful manifestation, which had about it the sharpness and volume of a thunderclap, followed by an angry roar, which died away as a hopeless groan. The fearsome sound," he said, "seemed to come from a point not more than 50 yards from us, near the end of the great bridge. The night was one of bright starlight, and we could have seen anyone on the bridge, which was built of white stone with low walls. Father, who was also trembling, asked me if I was too frightened to be baptized. I was too much terrified to speak," James said. "So I answered by stepping into the water. I was baptized." End of quote. After the baptism, James said his father looked again around the bridge. There was no one there. Moreover, no one in the community seemed to have heard that blood-curdling shriek. But James said, "We heard it, and we shall never forget it." End of story. It is a true principle, my dear friends, that the greater the effort we make to be good and do good, the greater are the forces of the evil one arrayed to stop us. And by the way, that 11-year-old lad baptized that night, James E. Talmage of the Council of the 12 Apostles, who would one day write Jesus the Christ. This next story took place June 23rd, 1738, Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, England. Samuel Medley was born the son of Guy and Elizabeth Tong Medley. He came of goodly and prosperous parents. When he was of age, Samuel entered a school at Enfield, administered by his maternal grandfather. It is said that he showed early promise and a keen memory. At the age of 14, Samuel was apprenticed to an oilman in the city of London. But Samuel didn't like that work. In 1755, England went to war with France, and a law was passed that allowed young men to finish out their indentures, their training, as it were, in the Royal Navy. After the admirable example of his two older brothers, Samuel joined the Navy. Now, even though Samuel was raised in a religious family, he chose not to practice the faith of his fathers. Instead, he used only his lively wit for frivolity and worse. End of quote. End of quote. Much like John Newton, Samuel drank in the ways of the sailor and led a wicked life. However, all that would change with a naval battle in the year 1759 off the Portuguese coast near Port Lagos. The French and English ships were engaged, and the battle was pitched. A French cannonball shattered the mizzenmast close to where Medley was standing. A large part of his leg had been shot away, and Samuel was in serious condition. Despite the efforts of the ship's surgeon, the wound would not heal. Gangrene set in, and Samuel was informed that his leg would have to be amputated if there was not improvement by the next day. Biographers have said of that event, quote, "This was something of a shock to the wild young man, but remembering his grandfather and father's example, he thought he had best pray. He had been heading a very profligate life, but perhaps it was not too late." He remembered that he had seen a Bible in his chest and sent a servant to get it. All that night, Samuel read the word and prayed that the Lord would save his leg. The next morning, the doctor returned and found the leg had miraculously improved so much that amputation was unnecessary. This event had a profound catalyzing effect on Samuel Medley. He was discharged from the Navy to heal, both physically and spiritually. Not long after, his grandfather read to him a sermon preached by the great theologian Isaac Watts, and Samuel Medley was a converted Christian. He resigned from the Navy, married Mary Gill, and by 1766 was an ordained minister. In 1772, he accepted a call to minister in Liverpool, the home port of English sailors. Samuel became so popular as a preacher, especially among the sailors, that his chapel had to be expanded twice, becoming one of the largest Baptist meeting houses in the UK. Samuel Medley, after a life of love and service, died July 17th, 1799. He scribed his own epitaph as follows, quote, "An unworthy preacher of the gospel, formerly pastor of this Church of Christ, by nature and practice a miserable sinner, but redeemed by grace and the blood of the Savior, has here laid down his body, waiting for the bright and morning star. Come then, Lord Jesus." End of quote. From this debauched sailor turned saint came not only a legacy of love, faith, devotion, service, but also some of your favorite hymns. Indeed, one of the most compelling testimonies of the Lord Jesus Christ ever written and set to music came from the pen of Samuel Medley. Surely, somewhere along the way, this hymn has stirred your soul in your Christian journey. It was the seafaring convert to Christ who wrote these words, "I know that my Redeemer lives." What comfort this sweet sentence gives. He lives who once was dead. He lives, my ever-living head. He lives to bless me with his love. He lives to plead for me above. He lives my hungry soul to feed. He lives to bless in time of need. End of quote. Next story. Again, 2 days ago, My group and I were in York. We're traveling with Fun for Less Tours on this beautiful trip through the British Isles. And we were in York. We pulled into York and we met our guides and we got on our buses and we took a panoramic tour around the city. And so many times I've seen this happen. We passed over the Ouse Bridge, the Ouse River. And we went right over it. Nobody paid any attention to it. I couldn't interrupt the guide to say, "Do you know where you are?" Later on, when we got back on the bus, I told them the story about this woman. Margaret Clitheroe was born Margaret Middleton in 1556 there in the town of York. During her childhood, her father was a respected sheriff of York, and as she grew up, Margaret was well known for her happy, generous nature. She was just a very positive young woman with, it is said, an irrepressible sense of humor. Then in 1558, when Margaret was only 2, England became by a Protestant nation by the decree of the Queen. Just overnight, you're all Protestants. Well, in 1571, Margaret married John Clitheroe. Now, John Clitheroe was a butcher, and butchers plied their trade there in York at that famous street called the Shambles. We walked down the Shambles. Now, in time, John Clitheroe also became a chamberlain of the city, and together John and Margaret had 3 children. When John married Margaret, she was described as a beautiful young woman with a mass of light brown hair, clear skin, which was meaningful then, a cheerful nature, and again, an irrepressible sense of humor. Just a happy, beautiful woman. Now, for whatever reason, I don't know, in 1574, Margaret converted to Roman Catholicism. Her husband remained a member of the Anglican Church. And even though John didn't join Catholicism with Margaret, still he supported her. Well, in those days, if you didn't go to church, you were fined by the local authorities. Margaret was not going to attend Protestant services, so she was fined on a number of occasions, and her husband paid those fines. At least 3 times, Margaret was sent to jail for not going to church. Can you imagine such a policy in your ward? Well, that wasn't all. Her 3rd child, William, was born while she was in prison. Now, not only was it against the law not to go to church, but Catholicism was outlawed. Priests were outlawed. Celebrating the Mass in York was against the law, and Margaret was determined to celebrate the Mass and assist the priests. And so she was hiding the priests in a little hidey hole off of her house. That was a capital offense. And yet she did, and assisted the priests in secretly celebrating the Mass. Then, as it would happen, in March 1586, Margaret's house was searched. And as the authorities intimidated everyone there, a frightened boy revealed the priest hole. I've seen that place. A secret entrance to the hiding place for the priests. They opened it up and they found him, and Margaret was arrested and called before the authorities, where Margaret refused to enter a plea neither guilty nor not guilty. Because if she entered a plea, there would be a trial, and her children would be tortured and forced to testify. So, with no plea, she was automatically guilty. And even though Margaret was pregnant with her fourth child, they took her to the Ouse River Bridge. They stripped her clothes off, laid her down on the ground with a sharp rock sticking up into her back. The officers who were to carry out her sentence could not bring themselves to do it, so they hired 4 beggars to do the work for them. Margaret lay down on the ground with the sharp rock sticking up into her back. They then took the front door off of her house and laid it on top of her. They then began to pile rocks on the door. When the rocks reached 800 pounds, the stone was driven up into her back, snapped her spine, and Margaret Clitheroe was crushed. She died within 15 minutes. But the authorities, now again, imagine, the authorities did not take her down and give her a proper burial. They left her there on display for 6 hours. Then the city authorities took her body and disposed of it in a dumping ground, a garbage dump. Later on, a group of Catholics went back, found it, dug it up, and they said that when they found her body, it was uncorrupted. They embalmed her and buried her. The burial place would remain a secret, closely and carefully guarded among the Catholics of the city. So carefully was that secret guarded that today the grave of honored Margaret Clitheroe is unknown. Margaret Clitheroe died a martyr for her religion. The impact of that upon her daughter, Margaret's daughter was arrested and forced to go to church in the Protestant religion, but she refused and ran away, eventually making her way to France, where she joined a convent and became a nun in honor of her mother. Both of Margaret's sons, William and Henry, remained strong in their Catholic faith, and both of them became priests. Margaret Clitheroe was beatified in 1929 by Pope Pius XI and canonized as a saint October 25th, 1970 by Pope Paul VI, and today stands honored as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. My group, not their fault, they didn't know, the guides didn't tell them. My group walked right down the shambles past St. Margaret's Shrine at number 35. I stepped in. I sat down. I knew the story. I felt a hallowed presence in that place. Margaret's faith may not have been the same as mine, but standing up for your faith, there's something about that that touches my heart. But that's not the reason I tell you the story. For all the problems that America has, and it has many, I'm still free to choose the religion I want to go to and worship as I please. No one's arresting me. No one's executing me or my family. I can still choose how I worship, where I worship, or even if I worship. And I can still choose what I want to be. Thank the Lord for the wisdom of the founding fathers and a nation where I still have that privilege. Again, We are going into London tomorrow, and this is a story from London. It's called a crisis of faith when someone loses and begins to doubt their faith. And the deeper that faith has run in the past, the more devastating the crisis when it occurs. And unfortunately, crises of faith are happening with an ever-increasing frequency across this darkening world. I hope you are not one of those. Solid and strong, I hope you be. John Henry Newman was born in London on February 21st, 1801. He was born into a family of some affluence and was raised in the Church of England. And then at the age of 15, John Henry Newman converted to evangelical Christianity, a conviction he describes as more certain than that I have hands or feet. Shortly after, he entered Oxford University. We'll be there tomorrow, where he studied at Trinity College. In 1825, John Henry Newman was ordained a priest at Christ Church Cathedral at Oxford. In 1828, however, John Henry Newman's views began to shift. He became associated with what was called the Oxford movement, which was described as follows, quote, "This movement consisted of professors and scholars who were considered members of the High Church of Anglicanism. They suggested that the Church of England rediscover some of the older Christian traditions of faith that had been preserved in Catholicism. They noted that the historical study of the Church of England led them toward the Catholic tradition." Newman became a soul in turmoil, for while his evangelical conversion was real, his church affiliation was turmoil to his soul. He was Anglican by ordination, by baptism, but he was Catholic by heart. Moreover, things were happening in the Anglican Church politically that didn't set well with John Henry Newman. He wrote, quote, "I felt affection for my own church, but not tenderness. I felt dismay at her prospects, anger and scorn at her do-nothing perplexity. I thought that if liberalism once got a footing within her, it was sure of the victory in the event. I saw that Reformation principles were powerless to rescue her. As to leaving her, the thought never crossed my imagination." End quote. In December 1832, John Henry Newman set out with friends for the south of Europe. The new experiences that came with foreign shores turned his thoughts inward. "I was naturally led to think that some inward changes, as well as some larger course of action, were coming upon me," he said. Then, May 26th, 1833, at Sicily, Newman sat down while on ship, sat down on his bunk, and began to weep. When asked why he wept so bitterly, he said, "I have a work to do in England." He yearned to be home, but was delayed due to the lack of a ship. He was at Sicily, then he got on the ship. At last, he booked passage on an orange boat bound for Marseille. However, the ship became stranded in the Straits of Bonifacio. It was a sailing vessel. It was becalmed by a lack of wind. And then it happened. June 16th, 1833, John Henry Newman was sick. Sick in body, sick in mind, longing to be home and knowing not why. Frustrated, impatient, he was troubled with doubt about the faith of his upbringing, while his body struggled with the effect of illness. As he lay on the deck of the ship, gazing out through the darkening fog across the water and longing for peace and relief, he saw on the distant shore, a lighthouse. Gifted with inspiration, John Henry Newman penned the following words: "Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. Do not ask to see the distant scenes. One step is enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I loved to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. I loved the garish day, and spite of fears, pride ruled my will. Remember not past years. So long thy power hath blessed me. Sure it will will thou lead me on. O'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is gone, and while with the morn those angel faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while." That poem, later set to music, has given hope and comfort and peace to many stranded in darkness, both seen and unseen. If for you it is dark and you are far from home, look up and cry, "Lead thou me on." Last story for tonight. With his wife standing by, Robert Henderson of Penston, Scotland, and again, we were just there, was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Immediately after their baptism, hands were laid on Robert's head, and he was confirmed a member of the church, as was always the case. But during that blessing, Robert was promised that he would go to America with his wife and children and join the saints in Zion. Now, this really bothered Robert. There was no way, quote, "No one could promise such a thing and expect it to come true. He was a poor miner, and it was all he could do to keep food on the table for his family. Immigrating to America, while a wonderful dream, was absolutely out of the question," he believed. Well, nonetheless, Robert Henderson continued faithful in his native land, and life went on. One night he came home, and he informed his wife that there was an uncommon amount of sickness among the miners. It was determined by management that a new ventilation shaft needed to be dug to bring fresh air down into the coal mine. The bid was opened up to dig that shaft. Mary suggested to Robert that he bid for the job, which, after her insistence, Robert reluctantly did so. But to Robert's surprise and dismay, he won the bid. Now what? He had no idea where to begin. He had no tools and no help to dig such a shaft. Nevertheless, going forward with faith, Robert borrowed a pick and selected a spot above the mine and started digging. He dug and dug, throwing the dirt up over his head until the hole was so deep he could scarcely throw the dirt up to the top. Now what was he going to do? He still had several hundred feet to dig before he reached the mine shaft below. And just then, he struck solid stone. Now what? He looked down more carefully and discovered a fault in the earth, a crack extending. He dug the crack out, and discovered that that crack ran all the way down into the mine shaft. When the fault line was cleared, it provided more air into the mine than any regular shaft could ever have done. So pleased was the mining company, they paid Robert the full amount, even though he had only worked a couple of days. Now, Robert and Mary Henderson had the money to go to Zion. May 30th, 1863, Robert and Mary Henderson set sail from Liverpool on the ship Cynosure, bound for America. The promise stood fulfilled. The Almighty once said, "It is my purpose to provide for my saints, for all things are mine." And he still can. And by the way, Robert and Mary Henderson came to America, joined the saints there, established themselves, and raised their posterity, and died in faith. This story was given to me by one of their great-great-grandsons, Dr. Kenneth L. Alford, professor of church history and doctrine, Brigham Young University. Who knows what little good decisions you make will still be rippling generations beyond you. My dear friends, I hope you are well. From Stratford upon Avon, England, good night, and God bless.